Hello, everybody. Today I would like to talk to you about the human population and its relationship to environmental issues. So, population is often seen as the boogeyman, right? As this monstrous thing that has to be taken care of and that is scary. And the discussions of population are often very emotional. There are images of marauding crowds that are starving to death and therefore desperate, and these are conjured up to get people interested in population issues or population control. Alternatively, we see people saying, well, the degradation of huge amounts of land on Earth and the chemicals of industrial agriculture and the health problems they bring about, these are necessary to produce the food that has kept starvation of millions, if not billions, of people at bay. Another way we see this is the loss of forest and other wild lands occur in order to house and provide energy for hundreds of millions of poorer people who might die otherwise. And you see these arguments over and over again like this. One of the most enduring metaphors is the idea of the population bomb. And the population bomb was the name of a book by Paul Ehrlich. It was published in 1968. We will read some excerpts in class. And the idea was that while population is growing, hidden within it is a bomb. There's going to be a terrible disaster that will happen soon when this bomb goes off. I think we should take a more measured approach to this and critically examine certain questions. We care about population growth because it's related to resource use and natural capital degradation. And I think it's clear at this point that no one group of humans should have access to more than their share of the planet's resources. And so that means that humans have to figure out how to share resources, and if there are more people, there may not be enough for us. And so that becomes a very scary proposition. Some of the things to think about as background is there are about 1.4 billion people living in poverty on the planet right now, maybe 1.2, but somewhere around that number, about an eighth of the planet. And we have to ask, is poverty due to a lack of resources caused by there being so many people, which is what's implied by the population bomb argument? The number of poor people is expected to grow in the coming decades, and at the same time, so is the living standards of many, many people. So the number of relatively rich people will increase as well. And we have to really think about how all this increase in affluence as well as increase in population will affect the planet's ecosystem's ability to provide for everyone. Now, population issues can be traced all the way back to Thomas Malthus, who was an English cleric who lived in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And we can find all sorts of examples in nature where populations overuse their resources and cause degradation of the environment, which then causes death rates to increase and causes the population to crash. And this is the basic idea behind Malthus. Malthus wrote that increases in productivity, meaning increases in wealth or food consumption, tend to be turned by people into an increase in population. As a result, the population is returned to its original per capita productivity, and starvation and population crash are therefore inevitable because population grows to overuse resources and population crashes as a result. Malthus's prediction infuses almost every discussion about human population because it is taken to be inevitably true. And that's something we're going to want to examine in this unit. Does human population cause an increase in death rates, right? In other words, as human population increases, if this led to more starvation, the death rate would go up. So we can examine Malthus's idea by looking at the correlation between human population and death rates. And the other way we can look at it, from the other side, we can say, do people who have increasing resources turn those into more babies? Is having more food, more wealth, does that get turned into more babies? So we will do that as we go through this unit. Population is often blamed for causing world hunger, right? So population causes hunger. But is this true? This is a Malthusian argument because it states that people are hungry simply because we have exhausted the Earth's capacity to produce more food. We are at the limits. It can often be stated people are starving because the Earth can't provide more. There are too many people. There's not enough food to go around. So if we find evidence that shows that world food production regularly falls short of need, then we would support the hypothesis. But if we find evidence that shows that world food production exceeds need, then we would have to reject Malthus's argument that hunger is caused by population. Similarly, population is often blamed as the cause of poverty. But is this true? The argument is Malthusian because it states that as a country gains resources and improves its standard of living, this is turned into more people. It's often talked about as more food equals more babies. If we find evidence that shows that as people get richer, they tend to have more babies, that would support Malthus's idea. But if we find evidence that shows that as people become economically more secure, as they have more wealth, they have fewer children, then we would have to reject Malthus's idea. Similarly, environmental degradation. Population is often blamed as the most important factor in environmental degradation. But is this true? It's Malthusian because it states that people have come up against environmental limits due to their overpopulation. The degradation is occurring because of so many people. If we find data that shows that poor people especially are doing most of the damage in the world, then it would seem to be true. However, if we find data that shows that it's wealthy people in the wealthy countries and consumption for those people that do the most damage, then we could not support the hypothesis. And I want to point out this really has to be analyzed on an issue-by-issue basis. We can't really make blanket statements here. Alternatively, though, we could find evidence that the most destructive technologies and practices are done by the rich and wealthy people or nations for the sake of the poorest in order to prevent their death. That would support Malthus. But if we find out that the destructive technologies and practices are done to increase the wealth of the wealthiest countries and people, then we would refute Malthus. So, it's really important in this unit that we think about this deeply. If population is the problem, we often assume that other people, those not in our community, those not in our state or our nation, are the problem. And if we think that way, that causes us not to consider if we personally, or as a community, or as a nation, play a role, or have played a historical role in the problems blamed on the population of people in other countries. And often the whole problem is seen as so complex that it causes us to despair, or it causes us to say, that's their problem, not our problem. So we'll have to be aware of that and try to counter that tendency in ourselves. What is very logical is that if there were fewer people, that environmental problems would be significantly reduced. And what I want to ask is this assumption true? And I think one of the ways to ask that question critically is to ask, with fewer people, would polluting technologies disappear? And which ones would and which ones wouldn't? Would the most environmentally destructive practices and industries go away if there were fewer people? Would the fossil fuel industry say, hey, we don't need us anymore. Let's just have wood to heat our homes, drive our steam engines. Would those go away? I think you can probably answer that for yourself, but we want to look at that. Certainly, more people with access to destructive technologies make the problems worse. But that is different than saying that population is the cause of certain environmental problems, especially if there are alternatives available that are less destructive. And we've already seen that in the case of energy, those alternatives exist. Finally, I want to say, if the evidence doesn't support that environmental problems and poverty are caused by population, this doesn't mean that human population is not a problem. It just means it's not the cause of that problem, and we'll have to talk about this. We don't want to fall victim to the problem with either-or thinking, and that problem is that we want to see one side as being completely correct and the other side as being completely wrong. And the solution to any two-sided argument is often to integrate the insights of each into a solution. Not always, but often. That's it for today. I hope this has framed the population problem for you in a way that makes it seem hopeful and more tractable. I hope you know who Malthus is. I hope you understand how environmental problems and poverty could be blamed on population. And now we're going to start to examine the data. In the next talk, we will look at the history of human population growth. We will look at the projections into the future. We will look at where population growth is the biggest issue right now. And we may go on to look at a couple of other aspects of demographics. Until next time, study hard.